Well, hello everyone, wherever in the world you may be, and welcome to my very first conversations from confinement. I'm speaking to you from Paris, where I'm going to host interesting chats with my clients and business owners as we discuss how they're tackling the challenges of COVID-19. And today I'm really excited to be speaking with SANGEETHA Iyengar, who's an award-winning human rights barrister based in London. She specialises in asylum, immigration, and international human rights law. She'll be taking to the TEDx London floor at the end of this year, and she's pressed pause on helping the underprivileged of the world to have a quick chat with me today.
SANGEETHA, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, great to be here.
You're in London, as I said. Give us an update on the current state of play there.
So we in London, we in the UK are now on lockdown, somewhat further behind you in France, Spain, Italy, and even India. It's been quite interesting to see the different governments approach urgency. In the UK, we've had a gradual move towards lockdown, and in the last few days, we've now been told we must not leave the house at all. In London, where the epidemic is more critical because hospitals are less equipped and it's just more populous, we are not allowed to use public transport anymore. And we expect, once the coronavirus bill goes through the House of Lords today, that we'll have police and army on the streets. But it's easier than you in France because we aren't moving around with papers. So it isn't quite warlike yet.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. So I think we're in day 10 of complete confinement now. We're allowed to leave to go to the supermarket. We were allowed to exercise, although that seems to be starting to be restricted now. We're allowed half an hour out within a kilometre from the house. And as you said, we have to have papers, which now have to also include the time we left the house, and we're not allowed to leave more than once a day. So, but it's interesting, you do adapt pretty quickly to a new life, and that's what it is. We need to get this under control. So we all need to adapt, don't we?
Absolutely, but there is a bit of a worry. So, I mean, in Western Europe, we're very privileged on many fronts, but this idea of moving around with papers, I was talking to a colleague yesterday in South Africa, which has a very dark recent history with apartheid, of movement being controlled with papers, and they are not in lockdown yet. They expect to be in lockdown by the end of the week, but that is going to bring back a very recent horrific dark memory. And the other concern we all have as civil liberties lawyers is, what's the overhang going to be? Are we going to normalize, you say quite rightly that a lot of this is necessary. Are we going to be used to living in a police state? Are we going to be used to only moving in a 1 kilometer radius? What are we going to normalize? And you start normalizing the unthinkable. So
it's true.
Last week, my entire career is spent improving access to justice and improving civil liberties for vulnerable communities. And yet last week, I found myself balancing this equation of, should I get on a plane to India, where my family are, be quarantined in a detention facility for 14 days, or should I stay in the UK where I have relative freedom of movement? And that was a perfectly acceptable equation for me to weigh up. And the only reason I didn't choose the detention option was I missed the boat.
You missed the boat.
Literally missed the last boat as the walls came up.
Actually, I wanted to have a chat to you about your domestic work, because I know the UK's line until just a couple of days ago in terms of the delivery of justice was justice is not optional, and that you were still in court, in hearings after restaurants and bars had closed down, and you were still attending hearings in really busy detention facilities. And I know with also elderly people. What's the situation there at the moment?
It's been shambolic. It's been incredibly disorganized. And what we've seen is which jurisdiction within the law is more prioritized in terms of the welfare of court users. So last week, before pubs and bars and theatres shut down, the Lord Chief Justice seized all long criminal trials. So any criminal trials with a jury obviously impossible to keep juries 2 meters apart, that were over 3 days long, were suspended.
Okay.
The family courts issued their guidance last Thursday, again before pubs, bars and cinemas closed. They closed for us on Friday. Immigration, the tribunal, we had to petition the president of the tribunal, that's members of the immigration bar, for the sake of our own welfare and the welfare of our court users. So last Friday, when everyone was at home and the streets were quiet, I was on public transport to a hearing centre in central London, as was my 74-year-old client, to attend a non-essential hearing. Now, whilst we would have gotten adjournment, so I had the hearing postponed if we'd asked for it, my client quite rightly said, well, in these times more than ever, I just need to know that I have confirmation of the right to stay in the UK. She's not an asylum seeker. She's not an unaccompanied minor. There's nothing particularly vulnerable or urgent about her case. But in uncertain times, you need certainty. Courts was still running non-urgent cases on Monday. Now, a hearing room in the UK is relatively civilized by global standards, but on Monday there was no soap in the ladies' bathroom, so you couldn't wash your hands. One of the sinks, the taps didn't work. There are only 2 taps in an entire floor. These waiting areas are packed. It's impossible to keep 2 meters away. Whilst you can do that in a courtroom and judges can be kept separate, court users cannot. You all pass through security. I pass through security. Security is going through everything in your bag. Whilst they wear gloves, they are then touching the contents of the next person's bag, patting them down. There is rife spread. They've now suspended all oral hearings, but we're still working out how it's going to work. There are urgent cases. Technology has not kept up in the courts. How are we going to be doing video hearings and telephone hearings?
So there's no infrastructure in place at the moment to deliver these or conduct these hearings via video link?
No, not yet. But I guess my optimistic spin on this would be to say it takes a pandemic to catalyze some action. So maybe the courts will go digital quickly. But there are problems with video hearings. So I might have access to the internet in my safe and quiet home and have access to a computer with a video a camera fitted in, as might the judge, as might my opponent. These clients that I represent are on or below the poverty line if they're not in detention. What access to facilities would they have? If they have access to anything, it'll be a mobile phone which is pay as you go. There's old school Nokias that we remember from the 90s. It isn't equipped with a camera, and there's no 3G or Wi-Fi that they have. And even if they do, how do we deal with evidence? So how do we make sure their witness isn't in the next room listening in on what they're saying? In courts, you would normally have the witness kept outside and brought in and separated. So there are problems. It works in other jurisdictions. It works in other countries. I'm not sure why we're so far behind here.
The difference between a face-to-face interaction and a video interaction is quite different in terms of understanding or getting a sense of a person. Does that come into play, do you think, in these hearings?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So one thing we're taught in bar school is witness handling. So reading someone's behavior and asking them questions based on how they physically respond, the levels of hesitancy, whether they look around, none of which can be captured on a telephone. So you lose that finesse in terms of questioning and in terms of witness handling. And then of course, a lot of the immigration clients are using an interpreter. And if they're using an interpreter and a phone, not a video, you then have no sense of kind of cadence of tone. Are they anxious as they're answering that question? Are they incredibly fluid and relaxed? And it's just the interpreter behaving sort of stumblingly through the words. There's a lot that will be lost, and there will be a lot of hearings that aren't fairly conducted and will need to be reheard. But the positive, and I am sort of determined to find the silver lining in these strange and dark times, is we will finally be digitalizing an entire field of work that hasn't otherwise gone digital.
Do you think that if more of the court work goes digital, that it allows for cases to be processed faster? Because I know that your courts have, it's like a couple of years of lag at the moment. So do you think that it allows an opportunity to try and catch up?
It could do. I think the backlog is there are twofold reasons for it. So one is a lack of judges. So if they recruited up more judges, then we could have more hearings. And of course, if they're remote, that would be brilliant. The other problem is for us in this field is the Home Office. So the Home Office aren't generating decisions quickly enough. And so you aren't getting the cases heard and getting them before a court as quickly as you would like them. But of course, if you're removing the physical space of a court, then you can fit a lot more people in. So that would definitely help. There are other problems though. So when I'm a barrister, not a solicitor, we have a split profession here. So I often only meet my clients on the day of their hearing.
Okay.
And you go and you meet them before the hearing, you have a client conference, you ask them the questions you need to ask. All of that is, again, largely based on their responses, and you finesse it based on how they're reacting. That's very hard to do over a video or over a phone. It's not impossible, but it disadvantages the client's access to legal counsel.
I'm assuming that a lot of your cases are highly emotional, and that the people that you're representing are probably quite emotionally vulnerable. Do you think that comes into play as well? Because those things can be really distractive in a video situation?
Hugely. So rather than just being anxious about the proceedings, they're anxious about whether the power cable is plugged into the computer or the Ethernet is working. Yeah. I mean, we had test litigation a few years ago that said that video link remote evidence in human rights cases was insufficient. People needed to have the right to come in, give oral evidence, be heard, see the judge, be represented, have someone look after them as well, which is also a job. So there's a massive loss. There's a real concern that their right to a fair hearing, which is enshrined in the European Convention of Human Rights, will just be removed. The other thing we were discussing last night, we had a conversation, there are about 42 of us, public international lawyers, talking around the globe. I think we represented 35 countries, about the measures coming in and how each country was dealing with it and our concerns, so that we could issue a joint letter. And one of the problems that we all raised was we have fought for decades to get these vulnerable communities before court, to get them the right to a fair hearing, to give them the right to speak and to see their accuser, or in this case, the Home Office, and to have their say. And there's a grave concern that the legislation that's coming in, the measures coming in, could dial all of that back, that we might just lose all of that progress that we've made.
Okay, well, it's an interesting time, isn't it, on that front? Let's have a chat about what's happening, seeing we've sort of moved to the area of international law and refugees. And I know something that's really close to your heart is the situation at the moment in Lesbos. And I think it's interesting for a lot of us, we really have forgotten to accept that it's actually a privilege to be able to put ourselves in isolation or confinement. And it's a luxury that those that are in refugee camps or in detention, that they don't have.
Absolutely. So at the moment, we've been pointing, and I'm definitely accused of this as well, pointing the lens inward and thinking about our kith and kin, our families, and how are we gonna get them the full spectrum of meals that we're used to having in a week delivered to their door.
Do they have enough toilet paper and pasta?
Yeah. And does everyone in my family have my Netflix login so that they don't miss the documentary?
I mean, now we're talking about important things.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, last Saturday we were remotely watching at the opera with a family in Bath and a family in New York. So whilst we have our concerns on how we're going to cope with losing our very luxurious life, there is a massive community, a global community that cannot abide the WHO guidelines. So the guidelines on social distancing, social isolation, washing your hands, not being in contact with vulnerable people like the elderly, and seeking medical assistance urgently or quickly when you have the symptoms. People in detention. So we had a case yesterday, which we lost in the High Court here, seeking the release of everyone held in immigration detention in the UK. So there are about 1,500 people who have no criminal activity. They're held in immigration removal centres without the ability to self-isolate. They're effectively prisons, whilst there are no removals. The skies are empty, there are no planes, the borders are all closed, they can't be removed, and yet they're being detained. And in those facilities, there are now confirmed cases of corona, and yet they're still being kept in detention.
And if they were to release them from detention, what would life be like during this period of time for them? Would they, because I imagine there would be detainees that don't have family or anywhere to actually go that's safe at the moment as well?
There are measures in place. So there's something called Section 95 housing, where the Home Office have to provide, it's basically a room in a property that is Home Office managed. So there are spaces, there are ways to manage it, but the Home Office is unwilling, and they can also go through reporting requirements, so they know you monitor people's movements, which is what the Home Office has been able to do. But they're not being released. They're going to be kept in a detention facility where they're not tested, where those who are symptomatic are not separated from those who are not symptomatic, where vulnerable people with asthma and respiratory diseases are not separated out. And now there is, of course, a lockdown on visits. So none of their family can come. We as lawyers can't come. Exactly. Interpreters can't come. That's in the UK. Something that's been keeping me up at night is the Greek islands.
So tell me what's happening in Lesbos at the moment.
So in Lesbos, there is now one confirmed case of corona on the island. The island houses 23,000 asylum seekers and refugees in a space that is founded on a camp that was built for 3,000.
I mean, those figures are just difficult to comprehend.
They're staggering. There are 4 ICU beds in the whole island. 4.
And so what can be done about this? Is there anything that can be done? What can be done at the moment for the situation there?
So, I mean, the problems that they face, the problems in the camp, are half of the facilities. There are inadequate facilities, obviously. 23,000 people, a space for 3,000. So half of the taps don't work. There's no water in them. Access any of the bathrooms, you have to queue for hours. There's no soap that's routinely provided, so you either have to be lucky and have one donated by an NGO, or have the funds to purchase soap.
So if we wanted to help, what NGOs are active there? Do they have campaigns that we can donate to, or what's the best thing that we can do?
There's a lot of fundraising going on, and that's brilliant because that helps buy soap, masks, gloves. Better than that, what we need to do is we need to move them. We can't have 23,000 people on top of each other. I'm sure there are people with corona symptoms there already. So there are campaigns going out at the moment, and I will share the link with you, urging the EU to get everyone out of the camp, to relocate.
Okay.
And
That'd be
resettle
great,
them.
because I'll put the link then in the comments. So how can people get in touch with you or follow you?
So I have a fabulous website that was built by you, which is www.sangeethaiyenga.com. You can find me on Twitter, which is @sangeethaiyenga.com. We're still working, so hearings are still being conducted remotely. We're still making applications. So you can contact the clerks at Goldsmith Chambers, and I'll be with TEDx at the end of the year. So
I'm looking forward to that. So I know you're flat out. Thank you so much for having a chat today. It was very insightful and interesting to see the issues that you tackle from your side of things over there in London. So take care, and to everyone who's listened today, thank you for joining us. Stay safe, look after those that you love and around you, and we'll see you very soon for another conversation from confinement.